Hi everyone. So this video is for people who are undergoing a psychological and or spiritual transformation and would like to mitigate the oftentimes inevitable collateral damage that takes place specifically within the context of family and community as a result of this. So to be very clear, this video is not for people who have already had a psycho-spiritual transformation. That is, unless you're still struggling with the effects of that on your family and community, or would like to take a stroll down memory lane with me. And it's certainly not for people who have not had a psycho-spiritual transformation. So this is specifically for people who are in the midst of one or who can feel one imminently approaching and would like to know what to expect from the effects of that on their interpersonal relationships. Now, obviously, there are various types of psycho-spiritual transformations that we can undergo, and if people are interested in that, we can cover what we collectively believe we know at this stage of human development at some point in the future. But for now, I think I'm simply going to define that process as a radical shift of one's orientation to oneself and life that cascades down into behavior, personality, relationships, and mission, and so on and so forth. And it bears also mentioning that one of the main reasons I decided to do this video was because while I've worked with people undergoing this transition for many years, it was really only since I began working with patients suffering from chronic illness that I began to realize that a very significant number of them were sick in large part because their psycho-spiritual awakening was being either compromised or suppressed entirely as a result of the misunderstandings of what they were going through by their families and communities. And so over time, this became a real staple of my practice, simply because it was apparently so widespread. And as a result of working in that context over the course of several years, it really became unequivocally clear to me that we still have just a harrowingly large gap in our mainstream understanding of not just what's happening in psychological and spiritual transformations, but in the family and communal systems within which someone is embedded when they undergo a transformation. So this is my own attempt to contribute a slightly more nuanced understanding of that process so that people can get the most of what's naturally occurring to them while minimizing the unfortunate but oftentimes inevitable byproducts of it. So, a psycho-spiritual transformation is a wonderful and incredibly destabilizing process to the status quo of your life that will often feel as if it's literally dematerializing you, or at least dematerializing who you thought you were and rematerializing you as the person you slowly over time begin to realize that you've actually always been. Unfortunately, because popular culture is still not well-versed in this process, surprisingly, even after centuries and millennia of well-documented developmental stages in the various contemplative and wisdom traditions, we still have no established mainstream language or behavioral norms, let alone well-thought-out safeguards to usher people skillfully through these entirely natural processes. And so what more commonly takes place is that people find themselves not only managing their transformations alone, but also having to defend themselves from the unavoidable torrent of projections and introjections and defensive, aggressive, reactive states of those around them, which in the absolute worst of cases can and does, as I've mentioned before, I now know this, lead to a breakdown of the nervous and immune systems, something that is just very obvious from working within chronic health patient populations. And so I think the first order of business is to understand just why is this conflict taking place at all between the individual going through the transformation and those around them. Because obviously one would have thought that it should be a celebration. And to answer that, it's really an answer in two parts, I think, largely. And so here's why, in part one. We have to remember that when a child is born into a family, they're entering into a pre-existing web of members that have already largely agreed on a number of conscious and unconscious constraints and influences and prohibitions that bear down on all the members, but especially the child, in an unspoken process of conditioning, right, for the purpose of molding that child into a shape that fits as seamlessly as possible into the pre-existing homeostatic network of interpersonal dynamics of the tribe, right? And so the child is a bit like a liquid that's poured into a mold, a liquid that over time crystallizes into a series of, you could say, unconsciously signed contracts and agreements with everyone around them. Agreements such as, we don't talk about this with dad, or we don't emotionally address this with mom, and so on and so forth, to oftentimes dizzying degrees of complexity, until a fully functioning lattice of these agreements and version of the child that have been groomed by these influences emerges. And this version of the child and of ourselves we could call the conditioned self. This is the person that you are trained to be long before you have any idea who you actually are. And we should acknowledge right out the gate that this conditioned self is one of the most fundamental safeguards of the collective, and how groups have maintained social cohesion for hundreds and thousands of years. It's actually a very stable and intelligent evolutionary mechanism that ushers new souls into peaceful coexistence with older ones. Another reason that this is a good thing is because it takes time for a soul to incubate inside the body, which is to say that it takes time for the authentic self to grow and emerge from out of the conditioned self, and for us to feel confident and ready to begin making the transition. In this way, the conditioned self is a little bit like an autopilot function that kicks into gear almost immediately, right alongside the autonomic nervous system, a bit like an autonomic psycho-emotional system. But that is slightly different in that it supports us for only as long as we need, and then when we're ready, will willingly pass the controls over to us when we're ready to make the switch, which we don't even necessarily have to, ever. Now, having understood all that, we can begin to see why this becomes such a contentious process with those around us. Because when we begin to make that transition, what's really happening is that we're attempting to unilaterally rewrite and renege a large number of those unspoken contracts and agreements that have been going on for years with our conditioned self, that our new authentic self no longer agrees with, all of which quite naturally is perceived as threatening to the homeostatic web that everyone around us has been calmly enjoying for years. Even, of course, if it's actually quite toxic and your authentic self knows it, but that's a larger topic that we're not going to get into just now. The point is that your impulse to talk about what you're experiencing with those closest to you is not simply born of a good and pure desire to share the fruits of your great awakening with those you love. At a deeper level, what's really happening is that you're attempting to process and, more importantly, stabilize your new authentic self with an interpersonal web that was only designed to scaffold your conditioned self, right? That's probably the main takeaway here. That when you undergo any kind of psycho-spiritual transformation and feel the need to get those around you on board, you're attempting to use a network that was designed for a previous you to bolster a new you. And so for those reasons, you will usually be met with resistance like going through a dramatic physical body change and then going back to your wardrobe and assuming that everything's still going to fit. It won't. And it's not supposed to. Transformation grows within us entirely new interpersonal receptor sites, and they need to be filled in entirely new ways, usually with entirely new people, with a few notable exceptions, depending on, of course, how much the people around you have experienced their own transformations themselves. And so it's important to really understand that when you're transforming, if you're not careful, you're also tacitly requesting others to transform with you when they haven't necessarily asked to, and in many cases don't want to, oftentimes because they can't, because it's not their time, and maybe never will be. And so here are a few key recommendations. When you begin to have your own transformation, one of the things that's going to happen is that you will want to ecstatically share this with others who you care about and who are close to you. Don't immediately do this. The vast majority of people will not care, and in many cases will perceive what you're doing as some kind of strange, oblique critique or overt attack, not only to them, but to the relationship that you have between you, that they must defend themselves against. So, to simplify all this, you could say that about 80% of the people around you are not going to care for what you're experiencing. Unless, of course, you're living in a hippie commune, which is a totally different story. Of the remaining 20% of those people around you, 10 will not only be disinterested, they'll be actively triggered by what you're going through. And you'll know exactly who these people are. So be kind, be respectful, right? Protect them from what you're going through. And I would say, don't go there. Just follow Buckminster Fuller's advice and don't try to change an existing system. Just focus on the building of the new one. Which brings us to the last 10%, which of course will include the people who can actually appreciate what you're going through, who know something of transformation, and who in exceptionally rare cases are actually going through their own at the same time. Although that's really a little bit like two people in the same family winning the lottery. It's exquisite and impossibly rare, but does seem to happen. And so all that being said, the most important thing for anyone to do during this time is to establish new relational beams and struts to support the growth and stability of that new self. And of course, the absolute best way to do this is to find a new tribe, and especially a guide. Someone who knows the process well and who can walk the path with you for a while. And there are a lot of them out there at this point. I know a ton myself, of different genders and ages and skills, and you will know them when you see them. And they will absolutely be your greatest ally in making sure this incredibly important and delicate transition is ushered through fully, safely, and most importantly, with minimal collateral damage. One final point about this. Do not think that you have to turn your back on your original tribe forever, even though it is often advised to temporarily do so, right? Because if you're able to take space from your environment and the relationships that were designed to bolster only your conditioned self, for the purpose of allowing your authentic self to fully come online, you will at some point be able to return and re-embody your conditioned self for periods of time for the purpose of reintegrating anything that you feel you've left behind, including people. People you love, relationships that you would still like to maintain, only now from a stabilized place that doesn't threaten your growth in the process. Right? So this would be the synthesis that follows the conditioned self thesis and the authentic self antithesis, you could say. Because it should be really noted that trying to build your authentic self while simultaneously attempting to maintain your conditioned self can be very, very challenging, if not impossible, and I wouldn't recommend it. One of the most common pitfalls I have seen over the years is when people attempt to manage both at the same time, which will often lead to an ongoing dilemma of feeling that the birth of your soul is being pitted against those you love. There's actually a Seinfeld episode with George Costanza when he goes through a variation of this. And I would not advise it unless you really have expert support. Finally, to end on a kind of historical note, this transformational process really has been explored for millennia in a long line of creative expressions, in, of course, the contemplative traditions, but also in mythology and folklore and scripture, and even, as I've already mentioned, in popular culture. And it's encouraging to remind ourselves of that, for example, in alchemy, we have the philosopher's stone and the cuniunctio, or the unification of opposites, which relates to this. In the Bible, John 4:44 coins the phrase, "Never a prophet in your own home," right? Which is a reference to the authentic self, never quite being accepted by those who grew up supporting the conditioned self, right? As part of that conditioned self web. That motif is actually also used in the movie Welcome Home, Roscoe Jenkins, with the inimicable Martin Lawrence. Mwah. Great Martin Lawrence vehicle. And it's also explored in the excellent animated movie Moana, right? Which, if you're a parent, I would absolutely use as a very profound teaching to your children. And of course, not to mention, lest we forget, probably the most exquisite modern cinematic example of this, which is the Truman Show, right? Which we should also say was the apparent catalyst, of course, along with Eckhart Tolle, for Jim Carrey's spiritual transformation, which he's been wonderfully and inspirationally and hysterically open about. And if that all wasn't enough, and it really should be, I think I'd like to end with a reminder to anyone going through something like this, that you're also supported by one of our greatest philosophers who have ever walked the earth, Friedrich Nietzsche, who understood and celebrated this process in his great work, Thus Spake Zarathustra, in which he outlines these three stages in his own stages of transformation. Nietzsche's first stage was the camel, which would be the conditioned self, because the camel bears the burdens of the world on its shoulders, including the familial and cultural contracts, silently and without resistance, until Nietzsche's second phase arises in the embodiment of the lion. The lion, of course, representing that first stage of the authentic self that bursts forth out of the constraints of the conditioned self, roaring and breaking free from the camel's prior burdens. The third stage, of course, being the child, that synthesis that follows the thesis and the antithesis, which would, for me, represent that return or circling back to the parts of ourselves and to those members we previously left and still love, during a necessary and final, but never-ending process of reunification that T.S. Eliot also spoke of when he said that at the end of all of our exploring, we will arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So we're all supported by a long line of individuals who have been expressing this to us in various ways. And so this has really been a fun one for me. So thank you so much for listening. And if anyone would like to explore this more, I'll be having another free Zoom call on Sunday, July 11th at 10 a.m. Pacific time to explore any questions people might have or to offer support to anyone who might need it. You can register below to join. Thanks again, and take care.